From New York, this is Democracy Now!
All Jeffrey cared about was go find me more girls. His appetite was insatiable. He couldn't stop. He wanted new, fresh, young faces every single day.
The serial sexual predator Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Authorities say he took his own life in his Manhattan jail cell, but the fight for justice continues for his many victims. Will federal prosecutors now charge Epstein's accomplices? We'll speak to a top editor at the Miami Herald. The paper's groundbreaking reporting led to the reopening of the Epstein sexual trafficking probe. Then to Hong Kong, where mass protests have forced authorities to close Hong Kong's international airport and ground flights in one of the busiest airports in the world. This comes after police cracked down on a number of protests over the weekend.
Hong Kong has just seen its darkest weekend in its contemporary history. We saw Kwai Fong Station being turned into a gas chamber, and protesters being pushed down a moving escalator by the police at Taikoo, where they had also fired at the protesters within a meter's range of an air gun.
And in Russia, tens of thousands marched Saturday in the largest anti-government protest in years.
Many people came here today for justice. I am one of them. I have lived most of my life under Russian President Vladimir Putin, and I am not happy about that. I think that there should be rotation in the authorities. It should meet the demands of people and to always support dialogue.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Federal investigators are probing the death of 66-year-old accused serial sex abuser and trafficker Jeffrey Epstein after he was found dead in his Manhattan jail cell Saturday morning. The authorities say he died by suicide, by hanging. Jeffrey Epstein was reportedly unsupervised in his cell despite being put on suicide watch in July after he was found unconscious with marks on his neck. He'd since been removed from suicide watch, but should have been checked by guards every 30 minutes and was supposed to have had a cellmate, neither of which were the case at the time of his death. Epstein's death came less than 24 hours. Hundreds of pages of court documents were unsealed with testimonies from former employees and new details of sexual abuse committed by Epstein, which also implicated a number of well-known politicians and others in the public eye, including former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson, former Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, Alan Dershowitz, the Harvard Law professor, Prince Andrew, and a well-known prime minister. Many have denied the allegations. As public speculation mounted following news of his death, President Trump joined in by retweeting, without evidence, a conspiracy theory that Epstein's death was the result of foul play by the Clintons. Epstein's accusers spoke out over the weekend. Jennifer Rose, who last month came forward to say Epstein raped her when she was 15, said in a statement, "We have to live with the scars of his actions for the rest of our lives. While he will never face the consequences of the crimes he committed, the pain and trauma he caused so many people. Epstein is gone, but justice must still be served. I hope the authorities will pursue and prosecute his accomplices and enablers and ensure redress for his victims," she said. New York prosecutors said the investigation into Epstein's alleged crimes would continue despite his death. We'll have more on this story after headlines with the Miami Herald senior editor for investigations, Casey Frank. In Hong Kong, where mass popular protests are now in their 10th week, officials have closed the international airport, grounding all flights. Many protesters are now rushing to clear the airport, fearing threats of more police action, but hundreds of activists remain. Thousands of pro-democracy demonstrators gathered over the weekend to protest police brutality and call for pro-democracy reforms, as they say the Beijing-aligned government is attempting to weaken Hong Kong's autonomy. Clashes broke out between protesters and police forces, turning especially violent Sunday night as riot police fired tear gas inside a subway station and were filmed beating protesters with batons. Meanwhile, mainland China has been ramping ramping up actions to oppose the demonstrations. Last week, China ordered Hong Kong-based airline Cathay Pacific to suspend any staff who support pro-democracy protests. We'll have more on Hong Kong later in the broadcast. In Russia, up to 60,000 protesters gathered in Moscow Saturday for the 5th mass demonstration in a month, and the largest demonstration Russia has witnessed for years. Dozens were arrested in Moscow as well as other cities around the country. Saturday's protest was organized to denounce the recent barring of opposition candidates from running in an upcoming election for the Moscow City Council. We'll have more later in the broadcast with the New School's Nina Kushcheva. Questions are mounting over last Thursday's explosion in the White Sea off the northern coast of Russia, which killed at least 7 people, mostly nuclear scientists. The blast caused a radiation spike in the surrounding area in Russia, and U.S. experts suspect it was caused during a test of a nuclear-powered cruise missile. This comes as concerns are growing over a renewed nuclear arms race between the U.S. and Russia, following Trump's withdrawal from the landmark Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Earlier this month, Russia's foreign ministry called the INF Treaty formally dead. In Norway, police say the suspected gunman who attacked a mosque near the capital Oslo Saturday has a history of posting white supremacist content online. The man, who is identified by local press as 22-year-old Philip Monshaus, praised the mass shooting in El Paso last weekend, which targeted Mexican immigrants, an April shooting in a San Diego synagogue. He also praised the massacre in Christchurch, New Zealand, which killed 51 Muslim worshippers in March. Saturday's shooting at the Al-Noor Islamic Center, which injured one 75-year-old worshipper who helped tackle the gunman, is being investigated as a possible act of terrorism. After the attack, the dead body of the suspected shooter's stepsister was found at his home. She was 17 years old. In last week's mass shooting in Dayton, Ohio, the gunman shot and killed his sister, along with 8 others. This is Irfan Mushtaq, the director of the mosque in Oslo.
For so many years, the secret police says the Muslims are the biggest risk for this country. But if you look at those last 2 major incidents of terrorist activities, it's non-Muslims who have done this. So, and this is affecting our children because the identity of our children has been broken up. We are harassed on a daily basis. And it's time for the Norwegian government to take a clear standpoint what they're going to do moving forward to make us secure in Norway.
In Yemen, officials from the UN-recognized government conceded defeat Sunday to the United Arab Emirates in the port city of Aden after southern separatists took control of government military camps in the presidential palace. This came after days of fighting that killed a reported 40 people, including civilians. Saudi Arabia threw its support behind Yemen's exiled president as the Saudi-UAE coalition appeared to fracture over recent days. The International Crisis Group warned Friday the situation in Aden, quote, threatened to tip southern Yemen into a civil war within a civil war. Tens of thousands have been killed by fighting in Yemen since 2015, and the ensuing food crisis has caused the death by starvation of an estimated 85,000 people. In occupied East Jerusalem, Israeli forces fired tear gas, sound grenades and rubber bullets inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque Sunday as Palestinians gathered for the first day of Eid al-Adha. Dozens of Palestinians were injured in the attack. Clashes arose after authorities allowed hundreds of religious Israeli Jews to enter the holy site of Al-Aqsa for prayer during Eid. Jews are usually allowed to enter the site but are not permitted to pray there. Palestinian diplomat and member of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Hanan Shrawi, said, quote, the storming of Al-Aqsa Mosque compound by Israeli occupation forces this Eid morning is an act of recklessness and aggression, unquote. The clashes at Al-Aqsa Mosque came as Israeli soldiers killed 5 men in Gaza at the separation barrier with Israel. The Israeli military said it fatally shot 4 armed Palestinians Saturday and another man on Sunday. In Guatemala, Alejandro Giammattei of the ultra-conservative Vamos party won the presidency after a runoff vote Sunday where he faced off against former First Lady Sandra Torres. He got 58% of the vote, with just 42% of eligible voters casting ballots. Giammattei, a former head of Guatemala's prison system, ran on a law and order platform promising to bring back the death penalty and deploy soldiers to the streets. He's been accused of money laundering, ties to drug traffickers, and extrajudicial killings. Giammattei has said he wants to modify the controversial immigration deal signed last month between President Trump and the outgoing president, Jimmy Morales. The deal requires asylum seekers heading to the U.S. border to apply for asylum in Guatemala instead of at the U.S.-Mexico border, and would primarily affect Honduran and Salvadoran migrants. Back in the U.S., former Vice President, 2020 presidential hopeful Joe Biden is coming under fire after he contrasted poor kids with white kids at an event hosted by the Iowa Asian and Latino Coalition.
We have this notion that somehow if you're poor, you cannot do it. Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids, wealthy kids, black kids, Asian kids.
Biden later said he misspoke while delivering his remarks. On Saturday, Biden said that survivors from the Parkland massacre visited him when he was vice president, when in fact the mass shooting took place last year, over a year after Biden's tenure in the White House. In a victory for transgender rights, a federal judge ruled Friday that a Virginia school board's policy which barred a transgender student from using the bathroom that corresponded to his gender identity is unconstitutional. The case was brought by the ACLU on behalf of Gavin Grimm, a former Virginia student. Judge Arenda Wright Allen wrote, quote, "Transgender students are singled out, subjected to discriminatory treatment, and excluded from spaces where similarly situated students are permitted to go," unquote. Grimm celebrated the ruling, tweeting, "I promise to continue to advocate for as long as it takes for everyone to be able to live their authentic lives freely in public and without harassment and discrimination." To see our interview with Gavin Grimm, go to democracynow.org. Four-time Olympic gold medalist Simone Biles won her 6th U.S. national championship Sunday, completing 2 historic moves in the process. She became the first woman to land a double backflip with 3 twists in a floor competition, one day after she became the first person ever to complete 2 twists and 2 somersaults coming off the balance beam. During an interview with reporters at the championship games last week, Biles called out USA Gymnastics for failing to protect young athletes from Dr. Larry Nassar, the former team doctor who was sentenced for up to 175 years in prison for sexually assaulting and abusing more than 160 young female athletes, including Biles. Last year, Biles revealed she was a survivor of Nassar's abuse.
It's hard coming here for an organization and having had them fail us so many times. And we had won gold. We've done everything that they asked us for, even when we didn't want to, and they couldn't do one damn job. You had one job. You literally had one job, and you couldn't protect us.
In more sports news, 2 U.S. athletes used their victories at the Pan American Games in Peru to protest President Trump and U.S. policies as they took to the podium. Hammer thrower Gwen Berry raised her fist at the end of the national anthem after accepting her gold medal. She told USA Today Sports, quote, "Somebody has to talk about the things that are too uncomfortable to talk about. Somebody has to stand for all of the injustices that are going on in America and a president who's making it worse," she said. A day earlier, Rayson Bowden, a member of the gold-winning men's fencing team, took the knee while on the podium. He later tweeted, "We must call for change. This week, I'm honored to represent Team USA at the Pan Am Games, taking home gold and bronze. My pride, however, has been cut short by the multiple shortcomings of the country I hold so dear to my heart: racism, gun control, mistreatment of immigrants, and a president who spreads hate are at the top of a long list," he tweeted. The U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee said Bowden could face disciplinary action for his protest. An acclaimed Chilean economist and environmentalist, Manfred Max Neef, has died. He died Thursday at the age of 86. Max Neef taught economics at various colleges, including the University of California, Berkeley, and the Austral University of Chile, where he taught until last year. He promoted development alternatives to address poverty. In 1993, he ran as an independent for president of Chile. Manfred Max Neef won the Right Livelihood Award, known as the Alternative Nobel Prize, in 1983, 2 years after the publication of his book Outside Looking In: Experiences in Barefoot Economics. This is Manfred Max Neef speaking to Democracy Now! In 2010 in Bonn, Germany.
In poverty, there is an enormous creativity. You cannot be an idiot if you want to survive. Every minute you have to be thinking, what next? What do I know? What trick can I do here? What's this? So your creativity is constant. In addition, that is combined, with networks of cooperation, mutual aid, and all sort of extraordinary things, which you no longer find in our dominant society, which is individualistic, greedy, egoistical.
That was Chilean economist and environmentalist Dr. Manfred Max Neef speaking in 2010. He died last week at his home in Valdivia, Chile, at the age of 86. To see our full interview with him, you can go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show looking at the shocking death of accused serial sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, who once counted President Trump and former President Bill Clinton to be among his many high-profile friends. Epstein was found dead in his Manhattan jail cell Saturday morning. Authorities say Epstein hanged himself. Epstein had been put on suicide watch after he was found unconscious with marks on his neck in July. But authorities had removed him from suicide watch 11 days before his death. The FBI and the Department of Justice have launched investigations into his death. Epstein had been in jail since July when he was arrested for allegedly running a sex trafficking operation by luring underage girls as young as 14 years old to his mansion in Manhattan. Epstein's death came less than 24 hours after hundreds of pages of court documents were unsealed with testimonies from former employees and new details of sexual abuse committed by Epstein, which also implicated a number of well-known figures. Men named in the papers include former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson, former Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz, and Prince Andrew. They have all denied the charges. Numerous conspiracy theories swirled online about Epstein's death. President Trump joined in by retweeting, without evidence, a conspiracy theory that Epstein's death was the result of foul play and somehow connected to the Clintons. Epstein's accusers spoke out over the weekend. Jennifer Arose, who last month came forward to say Epstein raped her when she was 15 years old, said in a statement, quote, "I'm angry Jeffrey Epstein won't have to face the survivors of his abuse in court. We have to live with the scars of his actions for the rest of our lives. While he will never face the consequences of the crimes he committed, the pain and trauma he caused so many people," unquote. Epstein's victims have been pursuing justice for years. Epstein was previously accused of molesting and trafficking dozens and potentially hundreds of underage girls in Florida. But Jeffrey Epstein ended up serving just 13 months in a county jail after the U.S. attorney in Florida, Alexander Acosta, cut what's been described as one of the most lenient deals for a serial child sex offender in history. Criticism of Acosta's role forced him to resign as labor secretary last month. While the federal criminal prosecution of Epstein will likely end, prosecutors can still pursue charges against any of his accomplices. Civil suits will also continue against Epstein's multi-million-dollar estate. Lawsuits could be filed as soon as Wednesday when New York's Child Victims Act takes effect. The new law gives all past victims of child sex abuse a year to sue their abusers regardless of how long ago the crime occurred. We go to Miami right now to be joined by Casey Frank, the Miami Herald senior editor for investigations. The newspaper's multi-part series published in November is largely credited with reopening the Epstein case. Casey Frank, thanks so much for joining us again. Welcome back to Democracy Now! First, share your response when you heard the news on Saturday. Authorities saying that Jeffrey Epstein hanged himself in his cell.
Shocked but not surprised. Jeffrey Epstein would have been a person who would enter the jail system up there with a blinking neon sign that would say potential suicide risk. And of course, there was the incident back in late July where he perhaps attempted to kill himself. The details on that incident are a little bit murky. And so what really surprised me was to find out that he was not, at the time of his death, on suicide watch.
I mean, this is extremely significant. He had attempted suicide in July. Many people thought, as you said, he was still on suicide watch. They only learned after his death that authorities took him off suicide watch and put him in a cell. The protocol is if you are taken off suicide watch, you would be in a cell with another person. He was alone in that cell. He was supposed to be checked something like at least every 30 minutes, which apparently he wasn't. The excuse given was that the guards were overworked, had worked overtime throughout the week, were tired. Many people are really questioning whether, in fact, this was a suicide or was it a kind of, sadly, assisted suicide in the sense that all of these suicide protocols were broken.
Well, the investigation of that suicide and how it was allowed to occur is one of many that are going to occur in the coming weeks and months. Although Mr. Epstein is dead, there are many investigative avenues to pursue, and we and others, I'm sure, are going to be pursuing them.
And William Barr, in fact, these are Barr's bars, right? This is a prison in New York, the Manhattan Correctional Center, which is run by the Department of Justice. Ultimately, the Attorney General is in charge. William Barr is in charge. He said an investigation will go forward, but as you pointed out, the investigation hasn't even been revealed about what happened the first time, whether it was Epstein himself who attempted suicide, or at that time he was in a jail cell with someone else. He said someone had attacked him.
Correct. I'm sure there will be video surveillance coming out, both from the original incident and the incident over this weekend. And that is along with employee logs and will tell us or give us some indication of what happened. And like I said, that is only one of many investigations that need to be pursued, despite the fact that Mr. Epstein is longer here to face whatever charges he was going to face.
Right. And that final point of video, they're now saying there is no video at MCC, Metropolitan Correctional Center. But Casey Frank, your newspaper, the Miami Herald, has an important headline. The headline says, the editorial says, "In death, Jeffrey Epstein is not a victim. The real victims still deserve justice." And that's what you as editor and Julie Frank and Julie Brown, the reporter, have been doing for months, giving voice to the victims. Can you explain what happens at this point, now that Jeffrey Epstein, who had been rearrested and was in MCC, facing 45 years in prison, what happens to the victims?
Well, several victims or alleged victims had stepped forward after Mr. Epstein's arrest last month. I think there were at least a dozen of those. I would expect to see more coming forward in the future. Bear in mind that a lot of these victims were very frightened to come forward over the years. It was very difficult for Julie Brown, our reporter, to get any of them to speak on the record and on camera. It took quite a bit of coaxing and quite a bit of courage on their part. As to what happens in terms of getting them justice, Mr. Epstein has a very large estate, as we know, and as part of the prosecution in New York, the U.S. Attorney's Office for Southern New York had made known that it was going to seek to seize the $77 million mansion of Mr. Epstein. Of course, that would have required convicting him of the crimes that he was charged with. He will not now be convicted of those crimes, and so it complicates the efforts of the victims, the lawyers for those victims, and the Manhattan U.S. Attorney to achieve justice through some sort of financial means. But they have said that they will continue to do so. In addition, as you said earlier, the conspiracy case that was filed against Mr. Epstein will continue. That means there will be other potential defendants coming forward. One that has been mentioned prominently is Ghislaine Maxwell, who was alleged to be Mr. Epstein's pimp. There are others. He had paymasters. He had schedulers. He had a large operation that served his alleged sexual trafficking machine, I guess you would say. And I would expect to see other people charged in the not too distant future.
Casey Frank, can you talk about the document release on Friday, hours before Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell?
Well, it was massive. It was 2,000 pages. We were still sifting through those documents when Mr. Epstein apparently committed suicide in his jail cell. So we're still going through those records. Much of what was in there was already known. The names that you mentioned earlier, including the former governor of New Mexico and the former majority leader, they had been out there in the ether before, whether they had been published or not. All have, of course, denied any sort of connection to the sexual activities involving Mr. Epstein's sex slaves, I guess you would call them. But there was other interesting information that we provided in our Saturday news coverage. Specifically, there was some detail about an au pair that was brought to the United States, I believe from Sweden, who worked for a couple who were friendly with Mr. Epstein. And she described, or rather, a butler who worked for them described how she was brought down to Mr. Epstein's island in the Virgin Islands, and allegedly Mr. Epstein and perhaps others attempted to coerce her into sex. She became very upset. She found her way back to the home she was staying in up here, and this was something that was somewhat new to us. There was also some detail in there about Virginia Roberts-Giuffre, who has been probably the most vocal of Mr. Epstein's alleged victims, describing in one instance how she ended up in a hospital as a result of the alleged abuse by Mr. Epstein.
And explain what Giuffre is saying. Explain what Giuffre is alleging in this case.
Well, Ms. Giuffre is alleging that she was essentially, lured to Mr. Epstein's estate in Palm Beach. Actually, she was working at Mar-a-Lago at the time, and she was brought to Mr. Epstein's estate by Ghislaine Maxwell to ostensibly learn about the skill of massage and also possibly be put through college and travel the world, what she found is that she was immediately turned into essentially a sex slave by Mr. Epstein and allegedly Miss Maxwell as well. And she, more than anyone else, has been vocal over the years in alleging not only that she was abused, but that this was a vast, far-reaching sexual trafficking operation.
Now, the whereabouts of Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of Robert Maxwell, the media baron who used to own the New York Daily News, who mysteriously died at sea in the early 90s, her whereabouts are not known right now. Is that right?
Well, that has been reported. We have not confirmed that, but clearly she's not in custody. Now, an interesting detail that came out at the time of Mr. Epstein's arrest or shortly thereafter was that 2 or 3 days after the Miami Herald wrote its stories in November, Mr. Epstein cut large checks to 2 individuals who were included in the non-prosecution agreement from back in 2008. And it would not be surprising if that money was sent to individuals who, for the purpose of buying their silence. I think that remains to be seen. That information has been kept close to the vest by federal prosecutors. But now I will raise another point, which is in the case of the Mueller investigation, there were sometimes people charged with crimes, and yet those charges were not revealed at the time the charges were levied for various reasons. Is it possible that some people have already been charged in connection with the Epstein case, but the fact of those charges have been held back because they were witnesses or because they have not been arrested yet? I think that is a possibility, and we should find out soon.
I want to turn to Lisa Bloom, who represents 2 of Jeffrey Epstein's alleged victims. This is Bloom speaking on MSNBC's Morning Joy on Saturday.
This is a very important time for victims now. They can still bring a civil case against his estate, and we are on the verge of filing one. We have started out with my Epstein clients working with law enforcement, cooperating with the prosecutors in New York because we thought that was an important first step. Of course, with his death, the criminal case goes away, but I want all victims to know that they can still proceed against his estate. And I'm calling today upon his estate to freeze all of his assets and not disperse them and hold them so his victims can get full and fair compensation for the lifelong injuries he's caused them. I've sat with my clients as they have cried and talked about how their life was changed forever by this predator, how they couldn't trust men, how their self-esteem was shattered, how their sexual relationships were destroyed, how their careers were derailed. They deserve compensation.
That was Lisa Bloom, who represents 2 of Jeffrey Epstein's alleged victims, speaking on AM Joy this weekend. Casey Frank, if you can respond to what she's saying and remind people the scope, the number of girls who have come forward, now, of course, women, and their estimated ages at the time they say that they were abused by Epstein or the people he gave them to.
Well, many of them say they were as young as 14 to 16 years old. We know that there were at least 80 alleged victims and probably many more. We know there are 80 because when Julie Brown started investigating this case 10 years after the fact, that's how many victims she was able to identify and attempt to track down. Now, many of them did not want to talk about their experience with Mr. Epstein, but a few did, and that's what broke open this case. And their courage is really, quite remarkable. what the attorney just said is very important, and it's important to understand that a lot of what's known about Jeffrey Epstein is not known because of investigations by state attorneys or federal prosecutors. Those investigations essentially went nowhere, and that's a whole other question. What brought out many of the facts about Mr. Epstein is lawsuits filed on behalf of courageous women who felt that they needed to speak up even several years later, now that they are adults. And yes, many of them, including the ones we have talked to, have suffered severe, lasting trauma, and they will be deprived of their day in court with Mr. Epstein, but these lawsuits will continue, and they should, and that's how more facts are going to come out about Mr. Epstein's activities and those around him.
And what about this new law that's going to affect in New York, the Child Victims Act? The new law gives all past victims of child sex abuse a year to sue their abusers, regardless of how long ago the crime occurred. Do you expect to see a flood of lawsuits after Wednesday?
I don't know. I am not very well versed on that lawsuit. I do know this, that when the federal prosecutor in New York filed charges last month, he made clear that the criminal activity, the alleged criminal activity, took place not just in Florida, but in New York and elsewhere. And so certainly for those victims who were in New York and who were victimized in New York, it would seem that that law would apply in this case.
What most shocked you as we wrap up this discussion, what came out on Friday? I mean, Casey Frank, you've been dealing with this case for many months, these thousands of pages that have come out, and then, of course, you're interrupted in that investigation as you analyze them with the death of Jeffrey Epstein. But in all of this weekend, what most shocked you?
I think what shocked me is this. There were 2,000 pages of documents involving a person alleged to have operated a massive sexual trafficking operation. There are many more pages yet to come. Remember, these are pages that are coming out because of a lawsuit filed by the Miami Herald, and this was just the start of that release. And I think what surprised me is this, that a court system would see fit to seal this information in the first place. And that genuinely puzzles me because it feels to me like this is information that needs to be aired out, not kept under wraps by any judge and any court. And maybe in this Me Too era, we're seeing a shift in the attitude towards such things. I understand that the names, and certainly agree that the names of victims should be kept sealed, but the activities themselves need to be aired out. And the fact that a judge in this case was convinced to keep all of this under lock and key surprised me quite a bit.
Casey Frank, I want to thank you for being with us, senior editor for investigations at the Miami Herald, helped lead the paper's coverage of Jeffrey Epstein. When we come back, we go to Hong Kong, where the airport has been shut down as chaos engulfs the airport. Thousands of pro-democracy protesters filled the travel hub Monday to protest police brutality. Stay with us. Waypoint by Mandate of Heaven. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn to Hong Kong, where all departing flights have been grounded as chaos engulfs the Hong Kong International Airport, thousands of pro-democracy protesters filled the airport Monday to protest police brutality. Many have now left the airport fearing threats of more police action, but hundreds of activists remain. The latest escalation follows a weekend of bloody clashes between the police and protesters. Confrontations turned especially violent Sunday night as riot police fired tear gas inside a subway station, were filmed beating protesters with batons. Others were severely injured on the streets as undercover police and the crowd began arresting people, pinning some protesters down against the pavement and violently restraining them. Police struck one woman in the eye with a projectile, sparking outrage. This is protester Katrina Ko speaking at a news conference Monday.
Hong Kong has just seen its darkest weekend in its contemporary history. We saw Kwai Fong Station being turned into a gas chamber and protesters being pushed down a moving escalator by the police at Tai Kau, where they had also fired at the protesters within a meter's range of an air gun. In Tsuen Wan and North Point, we also saw civilians being attacked by members of triads whose actions were harboured and supported by the police.
Katrina Ko's face was covered as she was speaking. This comes as Beijing has escalated its rhetoric against the protesters, with the Chinese officials saying their actions show signs of terrorism. Last week, China ordered Hong Kong-based airline Cathay Pacific to suspend any staff who support pro-democracy protests. It's been 10 weeks since mass demonstrations erupted in Hong Kong when millions took to the streets to demand the withdrawal of an extradition bill that would have sent people from Hong Kong to mainland China to face criminal charges. Demands quickly escalated for the resignation of Hong Kong's leader, Carrie Lam, an independent investigation into police brutality against demonstrators and pro-independence reforms. Pro-democracy activist and Nobel Peace Prize nominee Joshua Wong tweeted Monday, 100,000 protesters gathered at Hong Kong International Airport. We successfully shut down the airport and forced them to cancel all flights. Calls for democracy and free election will never stop. We oppose HK police state. Well, for more, we go to Hong Kong, where we're joined by Mary Hui, a reporter for the business news outlet Quartz, who's been covering the mass demonstrations for more than 2 months. Mary Hui, welcome back to Democracy Now! Describe what's happening now at the airport.
Yes, I was at the airport earlier this afternoon, and it was just completely packed with a sea of black protesters just filling every single inch of the airport, both the arrivals and the departure hall. They're all very peacefully and orderly sat down on the floor or walking slowly around the whole floor, just chanting slogans, venting their anger, the palpable anger that's just boiling and brimming. They're angry at the police, at the alleged brutality that the police unleashed, as you've mentioned, on Sunday against protesters on multiple occasions. The last that I saw from about an hour, 2 hours ago, was that protesters actually started leaving the airport and started marching on the road towards another town. And so the latest that I see is that the arrival toll is actually the crowds there have dwindled.
And explain the original reason for the protests and what they have now become, what the protesters are demanding.
Right, so this all goes back to June, 10 weeks ago now. All of this really started when an extradition bill put forward by the Hong Kong government, which would have allowed citizens to be extradited to mainland China to face charges where they don't have any guarantees of a fair trial and where the rule of law is not is not assured. So that really took people out onto the streets to protest against this. But in the weeks since, that has really evolved. The demands have evolved to include much broader demands, including setting up an independent commission to look into police misconduct, broader democracy, so harking back to the umbrella movement of 2014, and just more generally government accountability. A lot of the anger now is directed against the police. We really did see a change and a shift in public opinion after this armed mob attack against civilians at a train station in late July, and reports that came out from that appeared to show that police were either colluding with the armed mobsters who perpetrated the attack, or at least did not do enough to stop the attack. And that really got people out and angry, because what were the police doing if not protecting citizens? And then we have yesterday night's unleashing of somewhat horrific actions by the police, as we saw on multiple occasions, and people have really rallied around this single hatred and frustration directed against the police
We
at this moment.
played just that protester from the news conference today, her face covered, wearing sunglasses and a mask over her face. Can you explain why she's covering her face?
A lot of people are afraid of being identified. A lot of these rallies have not gained a letter of permission from the police and hence are technically illegal. And so the police have wide powers to then charge people for unlawful assembly or rioting. And given how rioting is defined under this colonial-era law in Hong Kong, it's a very vague charge, and you can be charged for rioting even if just passing by and being associated with people who are themselves carrying out violent acts. And so people are very afraid and worried. And of course, there's also the question of how much control China has now over Hong Kong's judiciary. Hong Kong has long prided itself on an independent judiciary where the rule of law is watertight and solid and held up to international standards. But I think more and more people are worried, and rightly so, that the rule of law perhaps is being chipped away and a more authoritarian way of doing things is being brought in to the city.
So the Chinese government is talking about charging protesters with terrorism. Can you explain the significance of this, Mary Hoy?
Yes, the rhetoric from various Chinese officials have really ramped up over the last 2 weeks. They have described the protesters in one broad brushstroke and said that they're all violent and radical. And of course, from what we see on the ground, that is not true at all. The vast majority of protesters are peaceful. And so what the narrative that the Chinese government is trying to put forward, of course, is that all these protesters are out to topple or looking to topple the regime, looking to challenge national sovereignty, looking to challenge one country, two systems. And so as that has been ramped up, there's been, of course, talk of whether protesters are towing or crossing the solid red lines that China so likes to put down. And so, of course, there's also worry that there may be the possibility of troops from the People's Liberation Army being brought into Hong Kong. That has not been ruled out by China, though they have also placed their full faith and unwavering support behind the Hong Kong government and the Hong Kong police, and told them to do whatever is necessary, to paraphrase them, to bring back social order and social stability and law and order.
And what do you expect is going to happen in the airport now? Are protesters afraid of what the Chinese government will do now that they've closed the airport? One of the busiest airports in the world.
A number of protesters. Speaking to several protesters at the airport this afternoon, I asked them the same question. What do they expect to happen next? And a lot of them really are feeling lost right now. They feel that the government has not responded to any of their demands, that the difference between right and wrong and just and unjust has been completely toppled overnight. And so I expect the protests to continue in whatever shape or form. It's very hard to predict, given that the protests themselves have been largely leaderless, quite fluid and unpredictable. That's been the spirit of the protest movement so far. And so it's hard to say what exactly will happen in the next few days and weeks. But what is for sure is that the simmering tensions and anger from the protesters are not going to go anywhere, and they will have to be expressed one way or another.
The South China Morning Post is reporting flights from Hong Kong Airport will resume 6 a.m. Tuesday. Do you believe that, Mary?
I think so. I think as protesters have decided that they have made their statement, that they have achieved what they set out to achieve, which was to send a loud message to get the world to realize what it is that the police has done and to bring some sort of disruption to the airport. They've realized that perhaps this is the time to back off. They've probably learned the lesson from 2014 from the umbrella movement that if they continue to inconvenience people for too long, they then start losing public support. And so 5 years on, I think they've learned that lesson and realized that once they've achieved the immediate goal, they can move on and go elsewhere and focus on the next
Mary
thing.
Hoy, we want to thank you for being with us. Hong Kong-based writer-reporter with news outlet Quartz, has been reporting on the extradition bill, has been covering the protests for over 2 months, speaking to us from Hong Kong. When we come back, we turn to the mass demonstrations in Russia, where up to 60,000 protesters marched in Moscow on Saturday in the largest anti-government protest in years. Stay with us. The Great Undressing by Jenny Hval. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to Russia, where up to 60,000 protesters gathered Saturday in the capital, Moscow, in the largest demonstration Russia has witnessed for years. Although the protest was officially authorized, dozens of protesters were arrested. Dozens more were also arrested in protests in cities around Russia. Saturday's protest was organized to denounce the recent barring of opposition candidates from running in an upcoming election for the Moscow City Council. This is protester Alexander Kostyuk, who was detained earlier this month.
I wanted to read out to the citizens the 31st clause in the Constitution to remind them that we have the right to gather peacefully and unarmed. At that moment, 5 law enforcement officers jumped on me from the back. One of them took the Constitution and a backpack from me. 4 of them forced me to the ground and started to beat me up. They hit me around the head with truncheons in their fists.
To talk more about the protests, we're joined now by Nina Khrushcheva, professor of international affairs at the New School, co-author of In Putin's Footsteps, Searching for the Soul of an Empire Across Russia's 11 Time Zones. She's also the author of The Lost Khrushchev, Journey into the Gulag of the Russian Mind. She is the great-granddaughter of the former Soviet Union Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Nina Khrushcheva, we welcome you to Democracy Now! Can you describe what's happening right now in Russia?
Something that we didn't expect to escalate so quickly, because I got to Moscow at the end of May. I went to the first protest against detention of a journalist, investigative journalist, anti-corruption investigative journalist Ivan Golinov at the beginning of June. And they were less than thousands of us. I mean, there were quite a bit of information about this. We actually protested the Moscow MVD headquarters, sort of the internal police headquarters. But we didn't believe that the next step would be just such a small thing as a Moscow city government election. The independent candidates would really bring the political crisis. And it's not just the Moscow political crisis that is taking place now in Russia. It's the Russian political crisis, because suddenly something that seemed to be such an uneventful thing as the Moscow city election became the event that suddenly the whole Russian police and all the branches of the Russian police, and there are very many, and you see it in the footage. There's this people who are called cosmonauts there in those black helmets, and the Russian guards and so on and so forth. So suddenly the Kremlin took over, because for the Kremlin, the way I understand it, the way I see it, from few thousand to the 60,000 that took place just this Saturday, people came out. For the Kremlin, this is, if you allow the opposition to take over, as they think, the Moscow city government, the next step with the Kremlin. And since Putin, at least for the last decade, has run Russia as a besieged fortress, and it's not just against the West, besieged fortress, but also from people that question his regime, then becomes a very scary proposition. So suddenly, from a very small event of local elections, it became an anti-Putin demonstration, or at least the way they are framed. And so, of course, no surprise, police got in, and now it's the power ministries that are basically running the show and saying, all these democracy games, they're ridiculous. Look what happens. And they're looking at Hong Kong, because we have 60,000, and Hong Kong had 200,000, many more than 200,000. So they're looking at Hong Kong, and I think they really decided that nobody is going to pass through this, and they're going to stand firm, and all these democratic games essentially over, as I'm sure they feel. And I think the difficult part for all of us, and I'm going to Moscow in a few weeks because I'm basically missing this great awakening of new sort of the new dissidentship that we're experiencing. I think the big question for us is how this regime is going to essentially become more Stalinesque than it already has been.
You have written, you have waited for this moment for so long. Can you talk about what this moment is, why it's so important? You're a fierce Putin critic, and why this rage of the country is now being expressed towards him?
I think it's a remarkable consequence of the comfort, in many ways, comfort that Putin brought to the country in the last 20 years, because Russians have lived better than they've ever lived before under any regime, the mass of Russians. And so in many ways, and we witnessed it in 2011, when in 2010, actually, Putin announced that he's going to be president again, and people went out and said, no, wait a minute, I have my cappuccino, I want to choose my president, and you are not my choice. And so now we're just experiencing the next step of it, because, for example, one of the results of the 2012 protests were, then the government decided we're going to make life even more comfortable. If you travel to Moscow, and probably one should before the borders get closed, it is an incredibly comfortable city. It's more European than Europe. It's like St. Petersburg of the 17th century, more European than Europe it is. And so they made it so people wouldn't protest. They made this humongous sidewalk so we just leisurely walk around. And suddenly, instead of that, people went to the streets. So I think in many ways, for me, and I've expected it for at least 10 years. For me, the moment is that it's a great anatomy of how power exhausts itself. It thinks that it does better because it makes people comfortable. But ultimately, when you make people more comfortable, people actually ask for the change of power. Because in many ways, in many places, and I did travel across Russia 2 years ago, in many places, it's not that they dislike Putin particularly. They're just incredibly tired of him. And after 20 years, that something happened to Brezhnev, something happened to Stalin to the lesser degree. And I think in this sense, that Kremlin power has exhausted its potential.
And who are the leaders of this movement?
And I think that's the remarkable part, is that it doesn't have the leaders. It's Alexei Navalny, the anti-corruption lawyer, who has been leading Russian opposition for many years now. For some years, he's being pre-arrested, as I call it. He's pre-arrested every time when the demonstration takes place. But I think what's important now, and that reminds me of 1991 more than of anything, when the Soviets went to the street and said, we don't want to be controlled by the Soviet Kremlin, by the hardline Kremlin anymore. People go to the street because they're fed up. They're tired. They want to have more dignity. They want to have a say in those comfortable cities that Putin made or Putin's people made. They want to have a say in what kind of politics they have. And so and that's why I call it dissidentship, sort of the open dissidentship rather than opposition, because it's not an opposition movement. It's a movement of people who are tired of the same system and want its renewal.
Nina Khrushcheva, I want to thank you for being with us, Professor of International Affairs at the New School here in New York. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Massoud, Trina Ndura, Maria Studio, and Maria Taracena. I'm Amy Goodman.